Good evening. My name is Peter Hammer. I direct the Damon J. Key Center for Civil Rights and teach at Wayne State Law School. And I want to welcome you to the final session of the Detroiters Speak series, Pandemic Politics from Lockdown to Liberation. And tonight we will be looking at the topic of Towards a People's Democracy. But I want to acknowledge the different co-sponsors that are involved in this production, namely the University of Michigan Semester in Detroit program, the General Baker Institute, the Damon J. Key Center for Civil Rights at Wayne State Law School, and the Department of African American Studies at Wayne State University as well. So we often end with visioning, right? So we start with history typically, and as the series go on, and end with visioning. So when we talk about thinking towards a people's democracy, we're really trying to get people to imagine what that type of democracy would look like. What does it mean to you? So kind of think about a minute as we're gathering in before we open up the session. What are the forms of liberation that would meet the hopes and dreams of Detroiters? Right? So imagine for yourself, what are the forms of liberation that would meet the hopes and dreams of Detroiters? Imagine what are the kinds of authentic democracy that we can build from the bottom up to meet the people's needs. Right? So think a minute and reflect on what are the type of authentic democracies we could build from the bottom up to meet the people's needs. If we reflect on Detroit's recent history, we have to recognize and wrestle with the fact that democracy in Detroit is on a life support system. And a lot of that has to do with the legacy of emergency management and on the ongoing reality of a financial oversight board. Rather than seeing municipal distress is what I call archaeological evidence of spatial structural racism. Recognizing that the collapse of housing values had to deal with white flight and overbuilding in the suburbs. The fact that there's been 70 years of the auto industry and manufacturing fleeing the city, right? So rather than seeing all the different things that have led to municipal distress in cities like Detroit and Flint and Pontiac and Benton Harbor, politicians process that reality through a very racialized belief system of blame and punishment, right? Blame in the sense that these cities can't govern themselves, right? Blame in the sense that they're not balancing the books, when the real challenge that these cities had were to cut their expenses faster than their revenues fall, right? To cut their expenses faster than their revenues fall, and that's impossible, right? But in this racialized lens of blame and punishment, Detroit and these other cities were subject to an emergency manager. And this emergency manager, by definition, is a destruction of democracy and civil society, and has ushered in a deeper regime of fiscal austerity politics in the form of the bankruptcy plan of adjustment. And a reality of that is something that we're still struggling with. Oftentimes, when you come to groups like this, you have to engage in some form of confession. I'm doubly cursed to be a lawyer and an economist, right? So when I think about a people's democracy, I'm somewhat influenced by economics as well as law, right? And there's a wonderful book that came out about 6 years ago called Why Nations Fail by Robinson and Asamuglu. And they said very clear that if you want to have prosperity, and I'm talking about a holistic view of growth and prosperity and not just a bottom line, that you have to have political inclusion and you have to have economic inclusion, that you can't have one or the other, and that a real democracy is going to be built on political and economic inclusion. So if I were to answer for myself, what is this question of what is a people's democracy? I would say that it's a place where everybody has access to the political and economic structures that enable them to reach their full potential, right? Well, that's just my opinion, right? And everybody else is going to answer this question in their own ways. And that's the wonderful segue to acknowledge the wonderful set of panelists that we've assembled here tonight. And I'm going to list them out with sort of a very brief kind of title and bio. And then we're going to go through a process and letting each of the panelists introduce themselves, right? And situate that introduction, explaining what their work is and how that work relates to the topic of tonight of a people's democracy. So we're blessed to have Toya Watts. Toya is the president of the Charlevoix Village Association, a lifelong Detroiter who lives in her family home in Island View neighborhood and has been fighting for years against encroaching gentrification of that part of Detroit. We're blessed to have Brendan Scorpio here. He's an organizer with the General Baker Institute, an organizer with Detroit Will Breathe, and an organizer with 313 Care Collective. He's a graduate student studying clinical mental health counseling. We're blessed to have Tawana Petty. And I've had enough time working with Tawana on panels that I know she introduces herself as a mother, and so I don't want to steal her thunder, but she is a mother, and that's her most sort of grounding experience. But she's also a poet and an activist, and is now the National Organizing Director for Data for Black Lives. And finally, we're blessed to have Josiah Rector, Assistant Professor of History at the University of Houston. So he's telecommuting with us here today, currently finishing a book about the history of environmental justice movement in Detroit, and is a graduate of the institution that I'm proud to teach at, Wayne State University. So in that same order, let's go through with a series of self-introductions where people can explain who they are, what their work is, and how it relates to today's topic. And we'll go through the same order that we just accomplished. And so start with Toya Watts.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Toya Watts, and I'm blessed to be still in my beloved parents' home right now in the city of Detroit, on the lower east side of Detroit, near Belle Isle. And so it makes a blessing that I still have a home to have. I'm in my 5th generation of family, so being here makes a difference, standing strong. And with the structure I had growing up in the neighborhood and with my parents in the community back in the day in the early 60s. So, and it's still a fight being in the neighborhoods or any neighborhood for right now, for me. And I was blessed that I was married twice, had 2 beautiful daughters and a granddaughter right now, and grew up with brothers and sisters in the home. And my mother and father came from Mississippi, so you know what that means back in the day with Jim Crow. And all of this going on. And we grew up with uncles and aunties in this house trying to survive back in the day in the early 60s. And I can't say no more about my family home, but joy growing up with 2 strong Black parents back in the day. So right now, when both of them passed away, and the last one was my mother in 2000, I got aboard with what we had back in the day with the family structure. In the neighborhood, you know, we played hide and go seek, green light, red light. You got to be on that porch at a certain time. You know, that family structure is means a lot to me, still being in this home. And that's what just motivated me to stand up to the plate to as a community organizer. I didn't know what I was doing when I first stepped out, learning the ropes, learning everything out here in the community. Who's gonna help, who's not gonna help, who's talking and who's not gonna do anything. So it made a big difference in my heart and soul, you know, being out here in the community. So I've started with a lot of people. People come and go in the community. People gives up in the community. So I started this group, Charlevoix Village Association, dealing with the elderlies that left off from Butso Family Center when everybody was leaving here off earth, dying and leaving. So I started from Butso Family Center. And that gave me the inspiration of grabbing people in each block. So it made a difference to build that strength up. People come and go, and the fight still goes on in our community. And just building that strength up. Now I got a hell of a team that's putting me over the map and educating me. I'm not a college kid, but I'm learning. So I'm just learning the roots of it, the democracy, that's what's going on in our backyard and what's going on down here in the gentrified neighborhood and the disrespect that we're getting as residents.
Well, thank you, Ms. Watts. Brendan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Brendan Scorpio, as previously stated. I am a 23-year-old graduate student at Oakland University, currently studying clinical mental health counseling. The organizations that I'm with are Detroit Will Breathe, the General Baker Institute, who I'm helping represent today, as well as the 313 Care Collective. And kind of just going into a little bit, gonna piggyback off of what was previously said, what kind of got me into the whole struggle and everything like that, is ever since my family came over to Michigan, as well from overseas, moving over towards the East Coast and towards Michigan, there's been this massive love for Detroit and the people in there. From my grandfather being a part of the wildcat strikes happening in the automotive industries and back in the day, to my father helping work to like get homes rebuilt so that way the city couldn't take them away from people. There's always been this love and this affinity for making sure that the people of Detroit are best protected and best put in the best positions. And this past summer was actually a really big time for me because that was the time that I decided to go out and best support the community in the way that I knew how. And that was through the marches that were happening, the demonstrations that were happening downtown after the George Floyd protests. And in that, through that struggle, it was after breaking the curfew that the organization Detroit Will Breathe formed out of people who were within the protests and who were in the front lines every single day from the younger movement, trying to push back against things such as previously stated, like evictions, wrongful evictions, illegal evictions, police defunding, things such as that. And from that struggle, I ended up being able to have the privilege and the pleasure to get to know a lot of the elder activists in Detroit that I had not been able to know previously. And through that, I'd become in contact with the General Baker Institute and Carolyn Baker. And through that, I've been able to help be part of the vision of creating, kind of going into the first question a little bit, kind of going into what a people's democracy may look like in the city and how we can best like create those systems and create those spaces for people to come and have those very revolutionary and those very radical conversations that need to happen in order to do what's best for the people. And outside of that, I also have like a great passion for the mental health within the communities, the mental health within the city. Growing up, seeing firsthand how little resources are given towards people in Detroit, especially in the areas of mental health, and being able to say, what can myself, along with other people from my generation, do to combat those and be able to get those resources to people and be able to make sure that not only are we looking at things such as financial and economic aspects of living in the city, but also like the humanistic standpoints of mental health, physical health, so on and so forth. And that's all I got for me. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you, Brendan. Tawana?
Peace, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Tawana. My pronouns are she, her, they. And I also go by Honeycomb. As Professor Hammer indicated, I am a mother. That's the first thing on my bio. Even though my son is 25 and getting ready to graduate law school, but still, I'm still a mom. Um, but I'm a lifelong Detroiter, and for my entire life, Detroit has suffered under a dominant negative narrative. And so I knew at a very young age that the ideas that were being fed to me was that this wasn't a city that I could be fully human in. It was it's not, it wasn't a city that I could be proud to live in. It wasn't a city that I could thrive in. At least that was the images that were being fed into me. That was the music that was being fed into me. Those were the films that were being fed into me. And so, as a poet, I was leveraging that creative opportunity to kind of try and flip the narrative. And so, I grew up knowing that a respiriting was needed. That a lot of community members were being dehumanized, and that I had to leverage my creativity in some way to try and respirit community members, especially young people who were growing up the same way I did, being in institutions and being taught that you had to grow up and get out of here. And so I leveraged my art in that way. And my artistic work led me to social justice organizing, of which I came into contact with the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center to Nurture Community Leadership, which then led me to the Allied Media Projects, of which I ended up becoming a convening member of the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, which then led me to direct the Data Justice Program at Detroit Community Technology Project, and ultimately has led me to National Organizing Director at Data for Black Lives. Under that work, I convened 8 hubs, Detroit being one of them, including Toronto, Chicago, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, DC, Maryland, Virginia, and there are others. I'm blanking on them, but my primary focus is on data, digital privacy, literacy, um, and so we use data to try and respirit and try and invest in a more equitable lifestyle and living for Black people specifically, all people, but Black people specifically. And so some of the work that I've been engaged in Detroit around that is the Detroiters Bill of Rights. And so my primary focus was the portion around safety, and pushing back between the conflation between safety and surveillance, and leveraging and consulting on ordinances against surveillance, and trying to change the city's constitution to ban face recognition and other mass surveillance systems like cell phone tracking, et cetera. But there are also many other aspects of Detroiters Bill of Rights that I'd like to get into today as we deepen the conversation.
Thank you, Tawana. Josiah?
Thanks to everybody. I'll try to keep this brief. I don't live in Detroit and I'm not from Detroit, and so I'm hesitant to join in like a conversation of Detroiters or for Detroiters. But I came to Detroit originally in 2010. I'm originally from Seattle, and I came right after the U.S. Social Forum when a lot of like young white gentrifiers were sort of moving into the city in the sort of Bing era, around the time of the Detroit Works Project. And I, as a grad student at Wayne State, I was doing oral history interviews with activists, and I was interested in learning about the history of the environmental justice movement in the city. And so I did a lot of interviews with people like Donnell Wilkins, founder of the Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice, with people in EMEAC, Zero Waste Detroit, people like, I talked to people like Rhonda Anderson, and then I had the great honor of interviewing a lot of the activists in the water rights movement. Charity Hicks, before her untimely passing, her murder really, by someone who will remain nameless, but also Marion Kramer, and Maureen Taylor, Sylvia Orduño, Ann Rawl, many other people involved in that struggle. And I started to learn about it. And now I see a lot of activists who are extracting value from Detroit, and people are building careers off of studying the suffering that is happening. And I've come to think that environmental racism includes the ability to profit from the production of knowledge about that topic without solving it. And so I've become very skeptical of the way academia relates to Detroit. And so as someone who's trying to navigate that in a non-exploitative fashion, it's kind of a learning process for me. But I'm trying to use the power that I have as someone who is documenting oral histories to broadcast and make available certain knowledge that isn't available. And I'd be happy to talk about how I approach that topic and what I've learned about it. But I also want to sort of be really reluctant to speak out of place as an outsider who has had the privilege of spending some time in Detroit and interviewing people.
Thanks, Josiah. We're going to go through that same ordering for the first question, and just ask people to give their answer to this. The following questions are going to do more like a jump ball, right? So we're going to mix up the order a little bit and hopefully get people to have some conversation. But I hope the people viewing kind of appreciate the diversity of voices that we've brought together, and how everybody's approaching this issue from a different set of life experience, from a different vantage point. And oftentimes it's that kind of collective analysis and collective discussion that leads to insights that if we only have one perspective, we don't hear. And I think that's one of the benefits of the Detroiter Speak series in general. But here's a question, and I'll read it twice. I guess I'll be thinking about it. And I'm going to go back to you, Ms. Watts, for you to be our first up. But the question is, what does a people's democracy mean to you, and what is your vision? So what does a people's democracy mean to you, and what is your vision? And the floor is yours.
For what I've been going through. Let me see if I can answer that, Peter. Democracy. I never knew the word gentrification until it hit me as a person. I didn't know what it was, what it mean. For them to come as the word gentrification got stronger and stronger for me as an organizer, as a community organizer. So what it means to me is our demands for the people. And the city comes down here with their plans and demands. And we was ready for them. And that's the key. We was prepared for them with our demands to feed back to them. And it made a big difference. They didn't think we had that ability to do that as people in a community that's illiterate. And they didn't think we could do that and put these together, these demands. And so that made a big difference because we wasn't at the table at the beginning. And then you come down here wanting us to be at the table with the disrespect, even for our city council wasn't nowhere around to even bring this to the table for us as people. They didn't call a special meeting at all to let us know what was going on. So we was prepared for the city government to come down here and to attack us with the gentrification and their planning and their democracy of us in our neighborhood. So it made a big difference to me, Peter. It really pissed me off with the disrespect they didn't give us as people living in this neighborhood. You've been disrespecting us. You've been putting your foot on our necks for how many years? And now you come down here and we never, ever sits at this table with you guys. And you just want to throw a plan at us like we're nobody. And with all that disrespect, and you still got your foot on our necks. So that was the biggest democracy to me. And my vision is we wasn't at the table at the beginning of the race, and now you want to say we're treating you nice. And I don't get it with democracy with the city. And I'm fighting two entities, the developers and the city government. So it just really frustrates me that I'm still fighting with them. So it makes, I'm fighting with the city and the developers when they come in my neighborhood. And we're not at the table with no community benefit agreements, no CBO. And they don't want to meet with us because the city said, y'all ain't got to worry about the community. We good. You ain't got to worry about the people, the few people that do live in the neighborhood. So that's stone democracy to me. Okay, that's my vision, to sit at the table with them, but they don't want to give a penny or inch. So that's me, Peter.
So I'm going to follow up just a little bit. What would victory look for the Charlevoix Village Association?
Wow, that we get a community benefit agreement to help us with some homes and stabilize and a library in our community, some victory that we need, some kind of, I want to say, some wireless internet in our neighborhood that some people can't afford the Wi-Fi. Anything that would be a good victory, a few things, okay?
Thanks so much. I just want you to know, and you know already, that you're a real example for people across the city about how to fight back. So
thank you.
That's my gratitude for all that you're doing and your association is doing.
Thank you, Peter.
Brendan, what does a people's democracy look like for you, and what's your vision?
Yeah, definitely. And just to start, I want to echo what Peter just said about the Charlevoix Village Association being an exemplary group that a lot of younger activists, myself included, have definitely learned a lot from. And off of that, when I think of people's democracy, the first thing that comes to my mind is community control, specifically for the people of that community. So that's been one of the conversations that's been heating up, and we've been having a lot of conversations such as that lately, is the idea of, at that point, what does community control look like? Because there are a bunch of different ways that could go. One of the things that we were talking about is right now in the city of Detroit, they were just going through, and Duggan's proposing his new, he's proposing just the new amount of money that's going to be going through. I apologize, I'm blanking on the word right now. But in that, it was the idea that what we're seeing right now is that the people are not being listened to. We had all summer people calling for certain things. You want to put money back into recreation centers. You want to put money you want to defund, take money out of the police, and then you want to put those into making sure people have things like transportation. People have things like food, water, those kind of things. And then, what we're seeing is we're having the exact opposite happen, where we have city council passing and giving their support towards spending $200,000 of taxpayer money to countersue protesters out here fighting for things such as a people's democracy. So what we're seeing right now in the reality of it is a clash between the state and the people for what does democracy even look like. And I think that's a very important thing that the General Baker Institute itself, that we are kind of working to have those discussions about what a people's democracy looks like from kind of the grassroots level up. And that means giving the space, such as the space we have here, and saying this needs to be a space for people to have those conversations, because we can't trust just as previously said, we can't trust to always be brought onto the table and brought here to have those conversations with the people that are currently making those decisions and ignoring the people, ignoring the communities, ignoring the people. So we need to have those spaces ourselves. And I guess kind of to ahead of time think about the next question for that would be what victory looks like. And for me and for the people I've had the privilege of aligning with, the victory, what a victory would look like for a people's democracy would be the people get to choose things like the budget. If the people and the community of Detroit come forward and they say, this is what we want the budget to look like, this is what we propose that looks like, that's be what the budget looks like. And it's not something where they're told, oh, well, if you come to this meeting and send this email and do this plethora of steps, well, maybe we'll actually listen to what the people have to say. It's about actually taking what the people say is best for their communities and implementing that stuff, and not just kind of doing the death by committee that we see a lot of times.
Thank you. Tawana?
Ooh, well, I'll touch and agree with everything that's been said prior to this moment. And I don't know if this is a good time to share my screen or not. So I'll just preface this with saying what I've been engaged with in the last over a year, the entirety of the pandemic, I should say, is collaborating with numerous community organizations, as well as Councilmember Castaneda Lopez, on what's called a Detroiters Bill of Rights. And what we tried to do was to pull in the demands from the street and put them into actual policy. And so I will, and a part of that is the defunding and reallocation of funds from DPD, and hopefully trying to put that into these things like affordable water, affordable housing, true affordable housing, which is based on the AMI of actual Detroiters and not the suburban rates that would then increase that affordable housing, true affordable water based on Detroiters' income, environmental justice, immigrants' rights, disability rights, and other amendments to the charter that we didn't write, but we also champion, like reparations and things like that. And so I just want to share my screen really briefly, and I want to show you all, oops, hold on. I always got to try to figure out how to pull up the right thing here. So I want to share my screen, and let's see if this works out. So I'll try this again. Give it up for technical difficulties. Can you see? You still can't see it, can you? What about this? Can you see this?
Yes. Now,
Okay, so this is an example of what actually Councilmember Castaneda Lopez has spent a lot of time with community organizers who have been part of the Detroiters Bill of Rights, and trying to figure out ways to pull from Detroit Police budget and pull it into the things that we have successfully passed forward through the charter process. Currently, the charter is before the Michigan Attorney General and the governor. And if we succeed, then these things will be put into place and be put before the voters in August. And so we are hoping to come through this charter process with, as I indicated, affordable housing, affordable water, transit justice, immigrant justice, disability justice, challenges against anti-Blackness, and centering racial equity throughout the city's constitution, and so many other things. And so I really hope that community members get behind this. We had over 1,000 community members sign on, as well as somewhere around 500 organizations. And so that work, and I lift this up as a people's democracy, because we spent sometimes 8 hours in a meeting nonstop. And Professor Hammer, I know you know, because you sat in on a lot of those. And so we would get on that meeting at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'd be going till well after midnight. And these are with charter revision commissioners who listened to our research, who went back and studied our research, we had to challenge them. We've been going up against the city. We've been challenged by the mayor. We've been challenged by law enforcement. We've been challenged by a lot of city officials who don't want to see us have an actual people's democracy. And so it is my hope that no matter how folks vote, that they do get an opportunity to vote on things like face recognition, to vote on things like cell phone tracking, to vote on things like truly affordable water, that they haven't to this point had an opportunity to have a voice in. And so to me, victory would mean that the people have an equitable say in how their city is ran and what resources they have access to, and that we would slow down this hemorrhaging of gentrification and keep community members in their homes. I'll end it with this. Right now, there's this big promo, which taps into that narrative I was talking about, the false narratives in the city. We have this big promo that like Dan Gilbert is giving so much money to the residents to help them stay in their homes. Well, Detroiters were mistaxed by over $600 million. And now we're being quote unquote gifted $500 million only to people who really, you have to have an income that wouldn't allow for you to be able to feed your family in order to quote unquote qualify. And so the disparities are just ridiculous. And so a people's democracy will mean that we get fact and truth and access and information, because lack of information and access is violence.
Thanks, Tawana. And little context for some of the listeners, especially those that may not be following the politics. The charter really is the equivalent of the city's constitution. And the mayor called for a charter revision, which opened that door. And what you're seeing here with Tawana and all the many people you're working with, I know it's a huge group of people and it's a group effort, are creatively using that to change the city's constitution in a way that creates more equity. And this notion of a Detroiters Bill of Rights is very similar to a positive rights agenda, which doesn't have a long history or even any history in the United States, but is very common in a lot of other countries that talk about a right to water, right, or a right to housing or a right to employment. So there's so much of Detroit is always innovating. And in my mind, this is one of the most exciting new innovations that's coming out of Detroit in the context of this Detroiters Bill of Rights. But Josiah, you're up.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with everything that's been said so far, and much of what I say is going to echo what has been said. So I guess the way I'm going to approach this is, instead of saying what I think should happen as someone who doesn't even live in Detroit, I'm going to summarize some of what I've heard from the over 50 Detroiters I've interviewed who are involved in environmental justice activism in the city. And I'm going to sum up some of the themes that I've found in their comments and remarks. I want to start with something that Maureen Taylor of the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization said in 2007, and I'm going to post it in the chat. Okay, so this is something again that Maureen Taylor said in 2007. Access to water, access to means of survival is one of the tenets that democracy is built on. When you have a class of people that are denied the ability to live, that is a straight up democratic fight. Your children are under attack. Your survival is under attack. All of our elected officials, 90% of them look the other way. Now, one thing to say about this is, one thing I learned actually in interviewing Marion Kramer, but this shows up in some of her other interviews, not Maureen Taylor, but Marion Kramer, is that when she came to Detroit from Louisiana in 1964 and became involved in the West Central organization, they were already doing sit-ins to protest utility shutoffs. They even went to some executives for Michigan Consolidated Gas Company, I think in Grosse Pointe, and protested. So these protests against utility shutoffs have been going on for well over 50 years in Detroit. There's a long history. I mean, I know Marion Kramer was getting arrested in 1983 at the Michigan State Capitol doing a sit-in to protest utility shutoffs with the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization even then. So this is an old fight, but the shutoff struggle was sporadic in the 80s and 90s, but the mass shutoffs only started in 2002 when Governor Engler canceled the vendor pay program. And this is after Clinton gutted AFDC in 1996 with welfare reform, but then Engler cut off utility assistance for TANF recipients. And immediately over 30,000 people were getting their water, lights, and gas shut off in Highland Park and in Detroit. And in that struggle between 2002 and 2007, it coincides with Engler's imposition of emergency managers in Highland Park and in Hamtramck also, but it's in Highland Park in particular where the Michigan Welfare Rights Organization and the Highland Park Human Rights Coalition really started this major struggle against water shutoffs, and that's chronicled in the film The Waterfront. If you haven't seen it, check it out. So in 2007, Maureen Taylor was already talking about this huge class of people living without water. And I think the reason I say that, and I don't want to go on too long here, is I think this does take us to the roots of democracy, right? Because democracy etymologically means rule by the people, and which we've never had in the United States ever, particularly for African Americans and other people of color. But you know, I think you can think about it as levels, right? Like, to the most minimal definition of rule by the people would have to require not being murdered by police, not being murdered by the state by having your water turned off, or murdered by industrial polluters, whether it be Marathon Oil or the owner of an incinerator or the operators of diesel trucks at the Ambassador Bridge. It was estimated in 2017 in a study by the Committee Action to Promote Healthy Environments that 690 excess deaths every year in Detroit are caused by air pollution. How many people are held accountable for killing 690 Detroiters a year from air pollution? Those industrial polluters are just as much murdering African Americans as Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd. But those killers are not held responsible. And these are powerful corporate entities and the owners of trucking companies, right? So in many ways, I think the Black Lives Matter struggle, which touched off the biggest wave of protests in US history last summer, you know, is pointing to the fact that there is no democracy without the minimum of equal protection under the law, not being murdered to begin with. And that's not news to anybody in this conversation, obviously. This is old news. And I also think about what's happening to frontline workers. I mean, General Baker's struggle with drum. I don't have to tell anyone in the Baker Institute about the struggle not to be murdered on the shop floor. Joe Carter's song, Mr. Foreman, please slow down your assembly line. I do mind working, but I don't mind dying. That echoes with the death of frontline workers today from COVID-19, right? So this struggle against not being murdered by the police, not being murdered by employers, not being murdered by polluters is the first order of business. That has to stop before anything else can be done. But it's not enough. To have a functioning democracy, everybody needs healthcare. Everybody needs housing. This has been said by other panelists. Everybody needs education. You can't participate in a democracy if you don't have access to education from kindergarten to PhD. It should be a right for everybody. So like, I feel like we're still at the foundation of even guaranteeing the most minimal rights that should have been guaranteed 400 years ago, but even, 150 years ago, the end of slavery in the 13th or 14th Amendment or the civil rights legislation of the 60s, we're still at square one as far as guaranteeing minimal human rights for African Americans and other people of color in this country. But a full flourishing democracy would require the positive rights that Peter Hammer alluded to. And so the last thing I'm gonna say, and I'm gonna shut up. I think there's two strands I see in environmental justice activism in Detroit: resistance against murder and prefiguration of a non-violent society. And the resistance against murder has included everything from sit-ins, strikes, protests, civil disobedience, whether we're talking Michigan welfare rights or all the different groups, Zero Waste Detroit, Breathe Free Detroit, EMEAC, Detroiters Working for Environmental Justice, all the different groups that have been involved in the labor struggles from Drum onward, but also prefiguring a different system. Whether we're talking about the Republic of New Africa and the Panthers breakfast programs, or we're talking about the Gardening Angels in the 80s and 90s, or Detroit Summer and Jimmy and Grace Boggs and the Detroit Black Community Food Security Network and mutual aid water stations and all the rest of it. So I think there are people that have been trying to enact democracy both by resisting murder and the denial of human rights and prefiguring a society that's not white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalist, and destructive of nature. And those two strands of resistance and prefiguration of a non-violent, non-dominating system are present in this long history of environmental justice and human rights struggle in Detroit. And there's so many people that have been fighting for this for so long, and it's so heartbreaking and enraging that this basic struggle for people not to be murdered has to continue at all. But here we are.
No, thank you for that. There's a question in the chat I want to sort of bring out because it's clarifying and it's directed to you, Tawana. They talk about that budget you presented and are asking basically, is the source of those funds of some version of reallocating police budgets and defunding the police?
Yeah, absolutely. In the same way that all the other systems have been defunded. And so what we're hoping for is that the inflated budget that allows for mass surveillance, that allows for things like face recognition, that allows for militarized weapons, that allows for all of these other systems. The police have been granted funds to respond to mental illness and things like this, situations that they should not be responding to. And so if you fund quality of life issues and resources to support quality of life issues, you can reduce quality of life crime, therefore not needing to inflate a militarized police budget. And so when you look at things like mental illness resources being so disinvested in, and you look at 300,000, I forget how the budget, I'm blanking on the budget, but it's some ridiculous number like 300 million or something. It's a really ridiculous number. And we're thinking of taking something like 34 million off of that, or and so yeah, it's like 330 million, and we're looking at 34 million of that. And so when people hear that, they're like, oh no, what are you going to do? You're attacking police. This is not police salaries. This is not police pensions. Even though I'm an abolitionist at heart, and we can talk about a world without policing on a different panel. But for now, what we're saying is these inflated funding and resources that are going for situations that law enforcement should not be responding to can be leveraged towards those things that we do need investment in, so that police can actually just be police and not try to be social workers and not be showing up at evictions and all the other things that they're not supposed to be doing. And also remove the mass surveillance out of our city, because we know that surveillance ain't safety. And that conflation has been very dangerous and has poured millions of dollars into resources that should not be weaponized against community members.
So thanks, Tawana. I want to thank Alana for that clarifying question to make sure everybody understands in many respects that this is doable, right? This is not asking for things that don't exist. This is saying we want to make different social choices about how our public resources are being spent and who is going to be benefiting. So I want to move to the next question. And the next question I want to do more as a toss-up, and I know it's a little bit hard with this technology. So feel free if you're not being recognized and there's a break to unmic yourself, right? So you don't have to have me as being the only person that's directing the discussion. But the next question kind of turns from this notion of vision to this question of struggle, right? And again, I'll read it twice. And then I'll just sort of invite whoever wants to sort of take it on first. And then to the extent that we can have a conversation in this forum as people are responding to each other, that's a wonderful way to be learning as well. But the question is, on which terrain must struggles for people's democracy be waged? Right. So on which terrain must struggles for people's democracy be waged? And I'll let, again, that be a tip ball for whoever wants to take that on first. These are not shy folks, so.
I can go first. We're all just very respectful of one another, so we want to make sure the space is here for everybody. But yeah, in my opinion, as far as terrains go, the first thing that pops in my head is intersection, like the intersection of struggle. And in my opinion, anywhere that capitalism is taking the rights away from people, people's democracy needs to fight back and give those rights back to people and make sure that's being upheld. And there's a multitude of ways to do that. And we've already touched on a few of them, such as like water, environmental justice, just asking for people to not be killed in the street for merely existing. Those are all aspects. And there's ones that a lot of people don't even realize. Like when we start to talk about things like community centers, there was just something I read today about and I have it written down here, about the Detroit Public Library, where 12% of its revenue is going towards downtown. And if you want to talk about just like a fight that needs to be happening in like areas that need that kind of emphasis, you have something as crucial as a library. And we've talked about it. Not everyone can afford Wi-Fi. Not everyone can afford computers. Not everyone can afford these resources. So things like libraries and recreation centers become these community centers. They're such an intrinsic part of how people learn and how people educate themselves. And to know that they're taking a vast amount of that money. Now, there's an agreement that was made in 2014 saying that should be about 5%. So the fact that they're going up 12%, 10%, 14% is outrageous. And in doing this, it's not just that they're doing the exact opposite of what the people and a people's democracy wants. We said that we wanted money to go from a police budget into the community, and now they're taking funds from the community and they're putting it into downtown for the main purpose of gaining capital and for the main purpose of making more money for those individuals up top that are the ones that are currently, for lack of a better term, having their knees on the citizens of Detroit's neck, specifically Black and brown people within the city. And I think that I know we're specifically talking about Detroit, but I think it goes out larger than that. When you talk about the fact that, like, you can't exist in a silo, whether it be as an organization, whether it be as a city, or whether it be as a country, you can't really, you can't really exist in a silo. You can't organize in a silo. You have to build network. You have to engage in other struggles. And a part of that's why the Black Lives Matter struggle this past year has been so instrumental, is the fact that speaking just from my own experiences with Detroit Will Breathe, we did work around with the Palestinian youth movement. We did work with the Yemeni liberation movement, gaining international struggles. We did work around when they were asking Detroit students to go back to school in the middle of the summer and in the middle of COVID without proper, like, nothing to do with testing, not proper protocol of that. There was things that we did. We're currently in a battle right now with Charlevoix Village Association around a specific person, Miss Geraldine, that we've talked about on social media about evictions and confronting predatory nonprofits. And I know that's a question later, but, like, when you think about terrains that exist, it's almost doing a disservice to one terrain to not include another one, because they are so connected. And in that, if you want to talk about things, just like keep going on examples, talk about something like somebody's ability to survive in a home and not be evicted. Well, that's going to be a larger struggle if they don't have water. That's going to be a larger struggle if they don't have access to education. That's going to be a larger struggle if, instead of money going into their library and their local meeting centers, you have that money going towards making sure that lawns look nice downtown for the people that come from the suburbs to spend money that doesn't actually help the citizens of Detroit. So again, not to continue to sound like a broken record, I'm sure everyone else will touch on this better than I, but, like, making sure that when you think about terrains, you have to think about it almost as an ecosystem. You can't just focus on one terrain or another one suffers. There has to be a level of intersectional struggle.
Thank you for that. Other comments on terrains of struggle?
This is my thing of that struggle, that power that we didn't lost, but we didn't lose it. That's why I feel, because when the election came, and I worked at the polls that day, for some reason, I wanted to see that change. And I feel that Wayne County, Detroit had that power to make a change. And it made a big difference. And the struggle that we're still going in, how do we get that power back and educate our people more strongly? We have the power, but we don't know how to strategize it, to make a change. The people from every district in this area, from the north end to the southwest Detroit, we got the power, but we don't know how to put it together to me. And so when you feed back on the city charter, though, Hammond, you made a difference, because there's a thing that's going out tonight. That's going around the CAC. We used to have the city district committee back then, but they took that money and that budget out of it. And so now we got community advisory committee. And I just feel there's no money in the pot, but it does make a difference to build that power. And where do we start building this power at for the people from every district? Because everybody, just like Brandon said, everybody, every area is struggling in our community. You hear one story to another senior, to another person that's struggling with kids, the schools, all of this. And I'm living next to Marcus Garvey. They want to take Marcus Garvey's name off of the school down here. And I told them it won't happen. We will protest like a big dog because of a gentrifying area. Now they want to take Marcus Garvey's name off of this school. So we came up with Charlevoix Village is doing this petition for community advisory committee to build power back into District 5 right now, and District 4 all over, all these districts. So I don't know how to put it, just building that power, educating the people, and they just feel that we don't have any power. Do our voices be heard? And the struggle that everybody's going through, the stories get out. I got a senior citizen over here now behind me on Field Street. They say they've been out of heat for 3 years. Why? That's what I just couldn't get over. I mean, the struggle, everybody's going through household to renters to all of that's going on in my backyard and all across Detroit. So we putting it together with CVA is putting this petition together, getting signatures in our neighborhood to build this community advisory committee. And to hear our voice, how do we build power? There's no money, but it's a start. And I know we can make it happen. And that's what I was just saying. No libraries, no nothing down here for our kids, no education work, no class and our resource. But you can build $1 million playground at Bustle Playground Center. $1 million, $1 million. But you ain't put no money into the center, no resource, no nothing for our community. And that hurts tremendously, especially a library, it hurts, it really do. So that's what I say about democracy, Doreen, depressing us more and more.
No, that example of the community advisory council is I think important for a number of reasons. It was a conscious effort to try to create new pipelines to democracy, get people involved in politics, train them in politics as a way that they could then be advancing to represent their neighborhoods.
Mhm.
It was an amazing innovation in the 2012 charter, and it never got implemented, right?
Okay.
But to sort of raise that question, what does that teach us about the charter reform now?
Yeah, what does it teach us?
Well, it means that getting it in the charter is not enough, right?
Okay.
This notion of saying, how do we then have our strategy to make sure it's implemented? And doing exactly what you're doing to make sure that that promise that was made almost a decade ago actually is fulfilled. So,
Okay,
that
I appreciate that.
it takes that.
Mhm.
Tawana, Josiah, thoughts on terrains of struggle?
Tawana, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say wherever there's conflict, we should be resisting it. Wherever there these contradictions that dehumanize us, we need to be struggling against those contradictions. And I really do think that we need a massive, and this is not me calling for religion. This is me saying we need a spiritual struggle. Detroiters have been dehumanized for a near half century. So it's no accident that there's a bit of hopelessness there, right? And so it's been a strategic propaganda assault for my entire life. And so it's going to have to be waged through art. It's going to have to be waged through media. It's going to have to be waged on the front lines, on the streets. It's going to have to be waged through policy. And then, as you were just saying, Professor, then we're going to have to hold, if we win in policy, then we have to wage a struggle for holding those politicians and the policymakers accountable to our demands. And so yeah, wherever there is an opportunity for our community members to be dehumanized, we need to be on that terrain, in that terrain, waging towards humanity. And so I'll leave it there and let Josiah jump in.
Okay. I don't have a lot to add to what has been said. I guess I would just say in general terms, as someone who I teach history to young people, and sometimes young people are very cynical, understandably, looking at the problems in the world. But I think that one thing that we are often not taught in our educational system is the way that social movements have won victories in the past, and the sort of dialectic between oppression and struggles for liberation, which I think is a constant theme. I mean, I think you see it in the history of Detroit from, the sort of settler colonial slaveholding elite from Cadillac and the McCombs and the Beaubiens and those early elites up through, the Henry Fords and the Durants and the Dodge brothers up to Dan Gilbert today. You can tell a story about Detroit as a history of elites getting rich, mostly wealthy white men off the city and oppressing people of color and so forth. You can also tell the story of Detroit that is a history of resistance, right? From, the Underground Railroad to the labor movement, the sit-ins, et cetera. And I just think that there is a history of victory in Detroit that can be told. I mean, there are real concessions that were won by the auto workers, I was actually just reading Jimmy and Grace Boggs' 1966 essay, "The City is the Black Man's Land." And they're writing in a moment where there's a lot of hope for Detroit as a beachhead of Black liberation. And this is, 8 years before the election of Coleman Young. And they're writing in a moment that was very hopeful, the year before the Great Rebellion in 67. And I think revisiting that, I think that you see this also in the evolution of Jimmy and Grace Boggs' work over the next 20, 30 years is, they saw victories by social movement struggle, but they also saw this sort of, the revolution didn't ultimately happen in the sense that corporate capital, white supremacy retained their hold in the city. But I think, there's so many different tactics that have been used from those that do direct action protest, to those that participate in electoral politics, to those that file lawsuits, to those that choose to work through the legal system or the electoral political system, to those that engage in more militant actions, to those that are more focused on the sort of prefigurative alternatives that we talked about before, whether it's D-Town or worker-owned enterprises like Ryder Industries. I mean, it seems like there are Detroiters that are implementing all these tactics from my stance from afar. And I don't think it's my place to say what direction people should go, but it seems like people are doing all of the above. But at certain times in history, those tactics can have greater purchase than others. And I think we may be heading towards a moment of greater possibility for social movements. I mean, we're in such a profound crisis on so many different fronts, both as a country and as a world right now. There's a possibility for deeper structural change.
No, first, I love history, so I really appreciate, I was reminding us of the victories we've had before, the movements, putting that in perspective. I really appreciate Brendan's sort of notion of intersections of terrains, and thinking again how the pending climate crisis can be another sort of source of motivation, and seeing these struggles as overlapping and joined to really require substantial structural change. Right? So I think there are reasons to be thinking of what gives us hope as well. But I'm going to turn.
Excuse me, can I jump back on Josiah right quick? And it hurts me when he keep mentioning Grace Boggs and James and them, and I'm 3 blocks away from these people home. And I never knew they even exist and still don't. And it makes me so mad that it's not a landmark at the corner of this house on Field. And it's just the history that need to be told. It is not being told to our young generation that people are still here in the neighborhood. You keep mentioning them. And I don't get it with the landmarks in the city of Detroit not being an eye popper for us and our kids to go by, even at Black Bottom area. I'm just sorry. I had to get that emotion. And they keep talking about Black Bottom, where my daddy used to shoot craps at and go down there, have a good meal and everything. But he kept mentioning about Grace Boggs, and I'm 3 blocks away. And I ride past, you wouldn't know Grace Boggs and James even reside here. So it hurts in our community.
And meanwhile, the names of a lot of people who committed human rights abuses are still the street names.
Mm-hmm. And her name is not being recognized.
Yeah.
She's not being recognized enough in our backyard. So it hurts a lot. So I have to tell you that because you keep mentioning them. So that's where I feel about it. The landmarks of our history in our backyard. Okay. Thank you, darling.
I love it. You can interrupt anytime because
okay, thank you.
Got wisdom to say, Brendan.
All right, thank you, Pete.
Real quick, not to hop back on it as well, but I think that there's a really good point being brought up about like propaganda within the city and how it leads into the dehumanization of Detroit citizens, especially those who have resisted against the powers that be. I mean, we talk about these people, these amazing humans, and there's no way of recognizing them, and they're seldom taught in any sort of history classes unless you're specifically looking for that kind of teaching. Yet right downtown near where we met every single day for to march, there is statues of Mr. McComb, who was a slave owner. And the fact that there's still statues of slave owners in Detroit, but there is little to nothing about the people who actually are put in the work to try to make Detroit the best place possible. And that kind of stuff is, in my opinion, despicable. And it's just a sign of how like the propagandizing and the erasure and the dehumanization has played such a large force. Because like I'm not to put her on the spot, but Carolyn, I was even talking with Carolyn the other day about why we don't hear about the League of Revolutionary Black Workers as often. And she looked at me in the most serious way and said, because the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in a lot of ways succeeded in what they were trying to do. And that's dangerous. So you're not going to learn about them. And I mean, yeah, no, that's kind of, I just had to jump in as well. The blood starts boiling.
Well, that's when people need to speak. So this is an open mic event. So if the spirit moves you, that's what we do.
Listen, oh, I'm sorry.
Go for
I
it.
was just gonna say that's why I put in the chat to Brenda's point. Detroit, I Do Mind Dying, the study of the urban revolution. Oh my gosh, that book was so transformative for me. And when you get to know General Baker in that book, in such a profound, powerful way, I'm grateful that I got to know him in real life, and spend time with him. And my claim to fame is that I have a poem that he told me he really liked. So,
Wow.
yeah, I get to keep that with me. But that book, the way, like, just his power in that book just comes across so similar to if you read A Taste of Power by Elaine Bryant. And there's like the beginnings of both those books really show you like the power of the people who have confidence in the movement. And it's just, it really is that's why words and propaganda, as Josiah was saying and Brendan was saying, really matters. And actually, Mama Toya was saying too, it really the stories we tell really matters. And so I'm going to do a shameless plug for Riverwise magazine. That's why we created Riverwise magazine, to be the stories of the people, by the people, distributed through the city. And I mean, now people are reading it all across the globe, but that magazine is meant to lift up the voices of the community members who don't get to have their stories told. And we're, in the 5th year now, and that's a big deal. And I want to publicly send love to Eric Campbell, who is the managing editor of Riverwise, and unfortunately has had a stroke, and is in recovery. And so I'm going to just lift him up and his family up in your prayers and your hearts in whatever way possible. But the voices of the people is profoundly represented within that magazine. And so we have to tell our story in every way possible, including in platforms like this one.
Yeah. And I want to lift up a comment that we got from Nair Sharif out of Flint, one of our sister cities, saying that the intentional erasure is by design. And really acknowledging that the people who write the history are trying to do it for a strategic purpose. And that means that we got to tell the stories of the heroes and the ancestors that are being neglected. Josiah, you had a comment.
No, I was failing to put down an emoji. I was just trying to co-sign that, and I didn't know the situation with Eric Campbell, and I'm sorry to hear that, and I hope he's okay, because he is an amazing journalist, and I've learned so much from reading his articles.
He's making progress every day.
Wonderful to hear. And I also just want to stress that the story is similar in Flint, and it's similar in Pontiac, and it's similar in Benton Harbor for very similar reasons. But this erasure of history, I mean, there's so many of folks, the houses where they were born that in other places would be, have the marks and the markers in historical societies aren't being preserved even, let alone, honored. That is a significant loss. And it's prominently the Black history that is being the one that's not being remembered and triumphed. So,
well, they putting the 500 million down there at Dr. Sweet's house though. And I still want some salt and pepper on Grace house. And that's what I'm pushing for, Grace Bob's house, okay? In the neighborhood. Okay.
It's in the process, Mama Toya.
All right, thank you, Tawana. Thank you, Sugar. I appreciate that shout out. I appreciate it. So I can put it out. Good news to hear. Thank you, darling.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, Professor Hammer, to respond to what you were saying, the Flint story, right? I remember we had the Detroit to Flint water justice journey, which folks walked for 5 days to Flint carrying brown water before it was even in the media. And Naira was leading up that charge to get folks to really be looking at the fact that they were drinking poison water well over a year before any public acknowledgement of what they were going through was happening. And the housing situation, we know a lot of the reasons why people leave their childhood and family homes in Detroit. Another reason is propaganda. From the very time that I entered school, I was taught this wasn't a place that you could thrive in, that you had to get up and get out of Detroit if you wanted to make something of yourself. And it wasn't until I got into my adulthood and saw that people were flocking to Detroit. I was like, wait a minute, if this is such a terrible place, why do people keep coming here? And so it really is, and we know that we live on one of the most valuable resources on the planet, our water. And former Mayor Coleman Young was saying, protect the water. And when you're dehumanized and dispirited and propaganda is so powerful, you don't always understand that you're on these types of resources because there's so much money spent to get you to forget.
I love it. There's one more question I'm going to sort of put out that was distributed earlier, and I'm going to truncate it a bit. But if we think about this notion of struggle and people's democracy, what's the role of nonprofits? Right. So we're going to say who are our allies, who are not our allies. What role can, should, or shouldn't nonprofits be playing in the context of this struggle? And again, it's a tip ball.
I throw myself under the bus first so everybody else can. I resisted the nonprofit industrial complex for a very long time, and resisted seeking funding and all those other things that come with being part of as a matter of fact, you almost had to join the nonprofit industrial complex in order to get funding for the things that we were doing with no funding. But I will say this, I believe deeply in reparations. And I believe that one of the few ways that Black-led organizations have been able to have any repair of harm is through getting funding through a nonprofit. It is not the end all be all. It is not liberation. It is not going to solve everything because it is still a part of the capitalist system. However, that the funding and the money was the wealth was raised off the backs of slave labor and colonization and harm and violence. And so I'm unapologetically having my work resourced these days to the best of my ability so that it can be reallocated in the community so that we can leverage our talents and our skills to create policy, to resist some of these systems. But no, I would love to work myself out of a job ultimately, so that you don't need a Data for Black Lives, or you don't need a Detroit Community Technology Project or any of the other organizations that I've participated in, because we've solved the crises.
I can go from there. Yeah, no, I think that was all like amazing points being made about kind of, I know there was a long-standing quote that's used saying that like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And that's been used a lot, being thrown around when it comes to nonprofits. And I think that we see a lot of nonprofits that make it hard to fight against that. I know right now there's a thing that I had mentioned earlier, we are working through with CVA and Detroit Eviction Defense about helping Miss Geraldine in her home being evicted, and that was against Storehouse of Hope on the land trust, and that's a nonprofit as well as I know there's been a lot of questions that were raised about the Black Lives Matter International Network and the money that they had been given, and what are they doing with that, and like why are more organizations not seeing that are doing like the grassroots work in the different neighborhoods within the cities. And I definitely, I mean, if the idea of a people's democracy and the things that all of us here had talked about come to fruition, and we work to fight it into fruition, then it's not I don't even think it's completely necessary for nonprofits to exist at that point, because like that's the work there. And just like Tawana said, like work yourself out of the job, quote unquote, in the positive way. And that puts in a tough position. There was one thing I was actually thinking about this question. I was researching it, and just because not a lot of people actually know much about the nonprofit industrial complex. A lot of people hear about it, but they don't know too much about it. Well, in a very brief, because there's a lot, as anyone can say, there's a lot of research on this. There's a lot of stories on this, but try to keep it as brief as possible. In a capitalistic society, the nonprofit industrial complex kind of forces nonprofits to work from the top down, or else they lose funding. And that's an issue that a lot of nonprofits that have this amazing idea and actually like are genuinely trying to fight for liberation that they may run into. Specifically, the 1938 edition tax code determined that if a nonprofit doesn't fit certain requirements, and if they aren't like bipartisan enough, and they fight to do anything related to dismantling the state, then they could lose all their funding. And it definitely puts a lot of nonprofits that are in really, really well aligned positions to have to deal with a lot of extra struggle. So like, it's a tough situation. It's a tough question to answer because of the fact that nonprofits in theory are these like super amazing things, but at times can be used as tools for the capitalist society. I mean, we're even seeing it. We dealt with issues where when we were down telling people that they should stand with us to break the curfews, the racist curfew that was being held in Detroit at the beginning of the George Floyd protests, we had these paid activists that were part of nonprofits coming down telling us that like, we're going to ruin the city if we do that. And that's not actually what Detroiters want. And that's where sometimes these bad names come in. And then we're also seeing situations where you have, I had to pull right here, they called it, I think it was called Strolling to the Polls, where nonprofits, specifically BLMIA, went through and they were telling people like, oh, don't put all your efforts into organizing for things like food and water and healthcare and fighting against these racist systems and fighting against capitalism. They're like, just go vote. And that's really all you need to do. And there is that thing, because like, without sounding like a broken record, and I'm going to shut up in a second, the idea of non-for-profits is such wide ranging, and they fit so, like the word itself fits so many different possible avenues that at times it forces you to get specific to talk about it. But that's just my thoughts on it.
Can I just say something really quick? And I know we have limited time and there are questions. Again, because as an outsider, I don't, I want to be careful with my words here, because I don't think it's appropriate for me, especially as an academic, to judge like how anybody raises money, especially given the challenges that organizations face. And I know so many great people who do good work in nonprofits. The only thing I want to say, and I don't want to name names here, is organizing environmental justice or interviewing environmental justice activists in Detroit. One thing that did come up at times was this issue of strategic philanthropy, where the worst situation is when you have corporate polluters, for example, giving money to environmental justice nonprofits. And that has happened. Marathon Oil has given money to some local, self-identified EJ groups, and that did play a role actually in weakening opposition to the refinery expansion in 2007. DTE Energy Foundation has given money to folks, and I've been told by activists, again, I'm not going to name names, saying that certain nonprofits at the neighborhood level in Southwest Detroit and elsewhere were reluctant to challenge DTE's shutoff policies because they were getting money from DTE Foundation. So this happens all over the country. I mean, in New Orleans, a lot of the housing nonprofits got money from the privatizers who wanted to tear down public housing. And it happens across the country. And so I think nonprofits, much like academia, do both good and bad. And I think there are people doing good within that system, but it's a system that's slanted to reproduce the status quo because of who holds the purse strings at the end of the day. But there are people that are using that system for good. And it seems like it's another terrain of struggle where it's a question of who is doing it and how and who is funding them. But I think there are people that are using the system for good. But that's all I'm going to say about that.
So Ms. Watts, there's a question in the chat that says, how did CVA get started? And how can that model of local activism and elevating of local voices be replicated in other communities? So people want to hear more about your story.
Demands. Y'all got to work together. That struggle. You got to sit at that table. It's going to take a minute to get the people that's going to put this work together, and that teamwork. You got to have I'm going to put it like this. You got to have a hell of a team. And that's the struggle I went through, dealing with the people, dealing with the strongness, the knowledge, the education, the words. And a lot of my people fell out. My elderly people fell out with me. We had a vote put it this way, on the word demand. And few of them fell out of the group. But guess what? They see what we did. Now they want to come back in the door. And that's what I just said. I said the word demand, is it a cuss word that we can't demand nothing? And they fell out with me about that simple word demands. So it made a big difference that we used the word, and I had to vote on the word demand to make something happen in this neighborhood. So now they back at the table with us. Now they want to do something. I say, okay, I can, move on. Life is too short. If we gonna work, it's gonna work together. We gotta, stop all this nonsense, the word demand. Oh, well, that's too harsh for the people. No, it's not. Demand. And once that word start hitting, that is our 11 pinpoints of what we demanded in our community. I don't know why it was so hard. I don't know why it was so hard. And we had so many, I'm gonna feedback on that, the nonprofits. I got about 7 or 8 nonprofits and then all these churches around me. And it makes me so mad when they're not sticking up for us. The knowledge that these people should have had, and the overtaxing, and the education these people should have had. And I used to work for a nonprofit. I had to bag out of it. I said, well, it was enough because nothing getting accomplished in the community. So I had to back away from the nonprofit. But now you want me to sit on your board for what? But you're not going to fight for the people in the community. So I'm not going to sit on the board. It's hard for me to sit on these nonprofit boards and they're not fighting and standing up for the people. They act like they're scared of the city government to say something about the struggle that people are going through in the neighborhood. So I'm gonna leave it like that, Peter, because I've been saying something I would regret. Okay, let me bag up off that subject. Okay.
Could you just read some of those demands? I was trying to get it, but my eyesight's getting poor. But they seem like they're powerful. Could you just read a couple of them so people in the audience?
Okay, you ready?
Yep.
Stop the displacement and the resegregation of Detroit. Implement the monitoring of tax foreclosure and eviction. Make home repair grants accessible. Make it accessible where you got to struggle about homeowners insurance and help with your property taxes. That's the biggest issue with people, because the homeowners insurance is like car insurance. It eats us up in a certain zip code area, and you know that. They go by the first thing is our zip code. So support the small Black and minority business run by long-term residents. That's number 9. No school closing. Invest in schools, libraries, and tech center. And that's Butzel Family Center that we're trying to do. So, okay. Protect and exist affordable housing. That's number 5. All blight removal and land repurpose must be decided by the community. And we never had that discussion with them. So reliable city service, yeah, okay, who do we call? A district manager? Yeah, true, okay. But that is just some of the things that we just sit down and put together and gave it to the HRD when they first came down here. Arthur, Maurice Cox, Arthur Jameson before he left, all of them people down there. And they didn't believe that we wrote this, Vincent Keenan. They think a nonprofit just wrote this little simple demand. And it just hurt our integrity that we couldn't write this. But he gave it to a nonprofit. Ask the nonprofit, did they write these demands for us? Oh, I forgot, we illiterate, as they say. Okay, so that's what happened, Peter.
I love that. But those demands are so important, but they're also both radical and simple.
Yeah, that's all. They were simple little demands. It wasn't nothing hard in technology, like we sending somebody to the moon or Mars. It was just simple. Just simple demands.
Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you.
Tawana, there's a question here I'm going to read out from the chat again. It says, for Tawana, could you talk more about the spiritual struggle and how it could be connected to resisting dehumanization?
Yeah, I'll just briefly and quickly say that we're approaching the anniversary of the assassination of Dr. King, and on April 4th. And Dr. King is someone that, talk about narrative. He's also someone who we know was deeply hated by the United States government, and assassinated. But then for the next 50 years, the United States government went on to glorify, water his legacy down, and make him acceptable in everyone's eyes. And so I'm glad that so many folks celebrate his life. However, one of his most important speeches, A Time to Break Silence, when he was struggling against the war in Vietnam, is an important speech that I hope that folks will join a global movement to read that speech on April 4th. But one of my favorite quotes from that speech is, we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. And that's one of the quotes that I've internalized within my work, and thinking about how and I would move beyond and say, that we don't put any of these things above living beings, which would go on to think about the earth and all living beings. But at the time when Dr. King was speaking about this, he was seeing how capitalism and automation and all these things were being prioritized over humans. And then we're in the age of artificial intelligence, mass surveillance, face recognition, and so many other systems that are being amped up and amplified to get away, to allow for these corporations to get away from being accountable to people. So yeah, I would say connecting more spiritually means to be looking ourselves in the mirror and seeing how our liberation is tied up with one another's. So moving in the vein of collective liberation or co-liberation, and making sure that we're not contributing to systems that dehumanize each other. And so that's what I mean by the spiritual warfare, is being able to look ourselves in the mirror and say, I at least did not create a worse situation than the one that I inherited.
I can't think of a better way to end our conversation, although I'm going to turn it over to Craig in just a minute so we can close out the series. But I want to extend my thanks to you, Tawana, to you, Ms. Mills, Brendan, Josiah, for coming and sharing your wisdom. I'm very glad that this will be available on YouTube, and other people can benefit from it. So my heartfelt gratitude for the four of you, and I'm going to turn it over to Craig to sort of close out our whole series.
Thank you, Peter. And I want to echo the gratitude that Peter just offered up to the speakers tonight. This was a really powerful discussion, and I'm walking away from the evening inspired by all four of you. So I want to thank you as well. Just a few words to wrap up our series. There was a planning team that included some great people here tonight, including Peter Hammer, David Goldberg from Wayne State University, who's not able to be here tonight, and Carolyn and Valerie Baker, of course, from the General Baker Institute, who put a lot of work into putting this series together. And so I want to just acknowledge the behind the scenes work, the emails. Thank you for reading my long emails, friends. I'm working on getting them shorter. It's taken me a little time, but there's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes, and I just want to appreciate the folks that put effort in. And lastly, I think it's the most appropriate thing to end with is to lift up and lift back up General Baker, who's been mentioned several times tonight. I also had the privilege to meet General and consider him, without question, one of the wisest, kindest people I've ever met. And this whole series has been about fighting in many ways, and I wanted to leave you fighting good fights. And I want to leave you with 3 quotes that I know are attributed to General. They're short, and they're powerful. And I want to lift them up. And before I do that, I just want to say we've spent this whole series listening to really important, including tonight, righteous struggles and fighters from We the People of Detroit, Flint Rising, who's watching tonight, Movimiento Cosecha, Project South, Detroit Will Breathe, Community Movement Builders, United Community Housing Coalition, Detroit Eviction Defense, National Union of the Homeless, Charlevoix Villages Association, and the General Baker Institute, and many others. And the 3 quotes are this: find a good fight and get in it. The victory is in the fight. And what's on the back of the sweatshirt that we were talking about earlier that proudly displays General Baker's image. Our task is to turn fighters into thinkers and thinkers into fighters. And I can't think of a better way to end than that. I'm grateful for all of you and for everybody that's watching out there. So thank you for being with us. And I think Carolyn Baker is going to take us out on the YouTube live stream.
Thank you, Craig. I enjoyed myself. That knowledge.
And thank you for quoting the unquenchable spark, Tawana. I love that too.
Yeah.
My favorite.
Thanks to all of you. It's a really fun conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Peter.